afternoon. It's Tuesday, about 4:40 here on the East Coast of the United States. Thanks for a good week. I'm just finishing up the last of your commentary. I know a few more of you have to check in, um, but I'll probably check in and just read some of your following comments after this, probably tomorrow at some point. So let's see, right to announcements. Again, I'll be available tomorrow evening. Via Skype. Feel free to message me via Skype anytime. Let me know if you're going to be around. I'll try to make myself a bit more available. Just look at my calendar tomorrow. I probably have 8 a.m. or 7:30 a.m. tomorrow through about 4 o'clock busy. So anytime after that, if you want to just message me on Skype, and then I can just sort of jump in after that. Probably again till about 8 o'clock at night. So let's plan something between, say, 4 and 8 tomorrow. Just message me on Skype, and we'll go from there. But I think that's 4 p.m., of course, East Coast time here in the States. Also a reminder that we're finishing up Module 3 today, which means we're on to the last module for next week, Module 4, and that's looking at resources and other approaches to teaching. I think that's where the discussion really starts to get interesting, because all of you have questions as to how this can look, and this is resource sharing, this is all sorts of good stuff, and really the practical pieces. In general, for those of you who've been participating, it looks like you have a strong sense of what the course should be about in terms of the philosophical approach, the approaches to teaching and learning, and then from what it appears, at least from reading your comments in the last two workshops, particularly this one, or last two modules, particularly this one with the internal assessments, I've got a good sense of what assessment can and should look like on this. So initial thoughts about the internal assessment. I feel strongly that a couple of things. One, I think these pieces in particular are really what sets GLOPO apart from other courses, either in Group 3 or in the diploma program in general. The political engagement activity, this idea of getting outside the classroom, the conventional classroom space. And that can occur on a number of fronts. I think, as I've alluded to earlier, there's folks who rely on simulations because of their geographic setting, where they really can't do field trips as we think about it, or experiential learning, and others who have access to a tremendous amount of experiential learning resources and field trips. All of that and more can be included in the political engagement activity. The point is, for all of it, it's really about getting outside the construct of the conventional class, and certainly the construct of teacher as source of information, and putting students in a situation where they can engage with politics and interact with politics on a number of fronts, generate research questions from there, and then produce an analytical report that triangulates their experience, their research, and a connection to the classroom dynamics. If we think about it that way, I think that's a solid way of thinking about the political engagement activity. I think I mentioned this in the past, probably in speech or in writing, but it's worth mentioning again. The last 2 years, my students have done very, very different political engagement activities. Last year, the group of students and we had sort of planned this, well over, about a year and a half ago, sort of seeing where the migration crisis was headed as a result of the Syrian conflict. A lot of my students were interested in migration in general, and so we did case studies on Rohingya coming out of Myanmar, and obviously the folks migrating from Southwest Asia and Central Asia to North Africa and then to Europe. That was part of the curriculum anyway, and during the fall, last fall, as the crisis was really reaching its peak, my students felt that the lack of awareness within their school community and the parent community was so profound that they wanted to do a public engagement, or engagement with the public, with the students on campus, with faculty on campus, as well as do a fundraiser for the UNHCR's Syria Emergency Fund. And so that came out of student interest in the subject. Now that work was relatively straightforward, but what ended up happening was because it was student-driven, I had a group of students who went over and taught lessons that are at the elementary school, the lower school, to fourth and fifth graders on what it means to be a refugee, a displaced person, person from Syria, the plight of children in particular, and taught lessons over there. I had folks who were canvassing lunch spaces on campus during lunchtime and engaging individuals in conversation as well as faculty in conversation. They set up a website to collect funds, and it was less about the amount of funds that they collected, because we only had a week's time to raise cash, but it was the idea of constructing a public awareness campaign that was really beneficial to them. That led them, so we have, just to review, we have classroom content experience, we have experiential learning, but that led each one of them, even though it was a group project, 2 classes worth, about 41 students. They all did the same type of broad-based project, but then they pursued individual lines of research and inquiry. So I had students who were looking at looking at trends in push migration factors as a result of armed conflict. Folks who then went and looked at the role of public opinion when it comes to immigrants into the United States or to their home country in general. So the crux of all this was that each individual student found particular lines of inquiry to go and research as a part of their PEA. And so it's that classroom experience, the experiential ed bit, and then the line of research that all culminated in that 2,000-word political engagement activity. The year before, a similar sorts of process, although this, well, actually not so similar process. In terms of experiential learning, we actually campaigned for a member of Congress, and that's probably the plan this year as well. But students went out and knocked on doors and did phone banking and did all sorts of work for the candidate, and then generated questions as disparate as looking at the issue of campaign financing, to legitimacy in how do parties or how do candidates construct legitimacy amongst constituents. And so again, group project or group experience, and then individualized lines of research. That was the way that this has been that worked for the PEA. I've seen it done similar ways in other schools as well. But the point really for all of this is that you want to take the opportunity to think about and to build durable learning experiences for the students, where they can go and research topics that connect to the curriculum through the key concepts or through some of that central column of the syllabus, that the content, to make that connection more and more overt. Interestingly, I haven't taught the politics of disaster for quite some time, but I've always had this idea of doing an IA where we actually go and engage local government and look at the politics of disaster planning here in South Florida. It's not just hurricanes. We have tornadoes, we have fire, we have, I'm sure, snowstorms. It would be possible if you've been to South Florida. It's fairly weird here on a daily basis. But really, the idea of disaster planning and the politics of disaster planning can be tied into really the PSIR unit, particularly Haiti, Typhoon Haiyan, Hurricane Katrina, although it's outside the student's lifetime. Nepal earthquake, tsunami, Asian tsunami. Really, anything any disaster can be viewed through a political lens. So I've had this idea for an IA. I'm not sure we'll ever get around to doing it, but that's the sort of thinking that you want to adopt. And my larger point here is that you want to localize as much as possible the experience that you're going to allow your students to do. Again, I've always approached this. Actually, I shouldn't say that. The first year I allowed students to do individual projects, and they didn't end up doing that well. I've seen schools where students do individual projects that are either a corollary to CAS, but of course you can't double up here and put CAS and the PEA in the same bucket. But students can pursue their individual, sort of projects. If you've got access to local government or national government, and internships, that's also a possibility. Working for NGOs and civil society groups are also viable. The key is to find, is really in the planning and ensuring, whether it's a group project or it's an individual project, that you spend the time with the students identifying the political issues that they'll be encountering in their experience or hope to encounter, and then make sure that the line of inquiry and research that they adopt makes that connection very overtly. Because without that, it's a struggle. It becomes students either write research papers, which do very, very poorly, obviously, or they write simply reflective statements about their experiences that meets part A and part B of the PEA mark scheme, but it doesn't really get to part C and D so much. So just planning around the PEA is certainly important. And it looks like that in your comments you got to a lot of those issues around marking, marking the samples, and particularly debating the strengths and limitations of each one of the samples. Again, I think I wish we would have more samples available for all of you, and I think the network that the Google Plus page that's available is helpful in this regard in terms of sharing our sources. Although you all as a cohort should be sharing your samples and ideas as well. And I think I've said that on several occasions. This is the network that you build within this cohort that's going to be very, very fruitful for you going forward. The other bit about the PEA is that I really think that if you have the opportunity, there's a way to do this several times in the course. Not as much as the HLITs, which I'll get to in a second, but the PEAs can be, like many other subjects, the anchor for learning and assessment. If you've got a school setting where you've got the opportunity to travel or to be outside of the classroom or otherwise engage in field trips and experiential learning, it's definitely, you can write these, you can use PEAs as a primary mode of assessment. So for example, if you had a fairly robust Model UN program that you were embedding in the class, and you did several Model UNs per year, you could have students write about their experience in Model UN, not necessarily as one to submit per se to as their IA, but use this as the structure of the political engagement activity to help the students frame their experience and their research and make connections to the classroom. So for example, if you've got a student sitting on the UN Security Council and they're debating potential intervention into South Sudan, for example, writing a 2,000-word PEA essay, research essay, and exploring concepts of power and sovereignty and legitimacy, peace, conflict, violence, nonviolence, human rights, any of the conceptual frameworks that we use, would really be a good way for them to do the work and to learning in general, whether or not, and of course practice being assessed by the mark scheme. Whether or not that ever gets submitted to the IB, it's a separate question. I find that teachers are sometimes reluctant to use the internal assessments as a primary vehicle for teaching and learning and assessment in the course. Oftentimes the IAs are seen as an add-on, and that's really not the intention here. If you have the capacity to do it, I would use the IAs as a cornerstone piece of assessment, really as much, if not more so, than practice paper ones and paper twos. So that's that's my thoughts on the PEA, and I think that offers us a transition then to look at the HLITs. I don't know how many of you are teaching this course at higher level, but the HL extension tasks are, again, one of the pieces that makes this course so interesting and so unique. As you rightly identified, many of you identified, it's a holistically assessed presentation, a case study where the student has to present orally. They're not just an account of a case study, but actually analyze and synthesize and use concepts and theoretical frameworks in order to make their argument. Sort of big idea first, and then we'll go to some of the mechanics that a couple of you have brought up. The first one is that regardless of whether you teach this at SL or HL, I think the HLIT is an incredibly powerful tool for engaging students in the subject matter, particularly in year 2, and secondly, allowing students to demonstrate their understanding in a variety of ways. At higher level, it counts obviously for 20% of the overall scores. But even at SL, where the HLIT isn't required, it's still a vehicle for students who, because they're not taking it at higher level, because this may not be their expertise, or it's group 6, or the language of instruction isn't their primary language, it's still a great vehicle for to allow for student work and to really pursue those those higher order thinking skills and assessment objectives that are outlined in the syllabus. So, for example, I know of a couple schools and a couple teachers who don't teach this at higher level and still use the HLIT as as a way for students to get into the subject matter. Specifically, rather than doing individual projects, they'll do teams of 3 and they have to do a presentation. And I've done this as well on a smaller scale to teach the skills that are assessed in the HLIT. But the idea would be is if you want to do something on child marriage, if you're looking at human rights, or if you're looking at particular case, if you're looking at case studies, say in Pakistan, for example, depending on how you approach the teaching of the course, you could have students work around, through the HLIT framework in teams in order to get an understanding of the expectations for assessment, the expectations for research, for presentation, things along those lines. There's obviously a natural crossover between the HLIT presentation and the TOK presentation, and that's not accidental. But the holistic mark scheme and really the overall approach to the assessment is one that has some parallel with the TOK presentation. So again, if we're thinking about learning writ large for the students, it's certainly worthwhile to practice these skill sets in your class, irrespective of whether you send this HLIT in, or this score gets submitted. I've spent the last several years allowing students to do multiple HL extension tasks, a minimum of 3 and more often 4 over about a year and a half worth of coursework. Maybe about a year, I guess, but by we count deadlines and things like that. And then allow the students to choose which 2 work best for them. And so, it's relatively straightforward in terms of the work and the presentation. We build, once we get to a certain point, allow students to do some more independent work, and then just it's basic deadlines and scheduling after that, and you're working one-on-one with students, or you're working on teams, or we're looking at, okay, we're doing HLITs in, say, public health, for example, which is great core extension. If you look at the politics of health, HIV/AIDS, malaria, Ebola, Zika, or non-communicable diseases as well, diabetes, cancer, things along those lines. There's great extensions between the PSIR and development unit on the one hand, and then the health extension task on the other. And getting students to work in teams, to think about topics and develop resources, and then pursue their own lines of inquiry. It's a great way to get students to do that do that work, and then they just cycle through that process where you're giving them time to research and to present, and you move from instructor as a source of knowledge to instructor as facilitator of knowledge and mentoring. Also good skill sets to practice when you're talking about timing for the extended essay as well. So the students who've written in politics, in the past couple of years, or written in world studies or peace and conflict human rights, all have sort of seen the seeds of their work in their extended essay. If have come in part from their work in the HLIT. So whether or not you're teaching the course at higher level or not, I think the HLIT is worthwhile as an assessment in the class, and thus a pedagogy, the underlying practice, to incorporate in that class as much as possible. The students tend to be more engaged, in my experience, and I think it allows for some higher order thinking. With respect to a couple of your questions, as I'm moving through here, regarding the HLIT, 2 or 3 of you mentioned this idea of the presentation and the challenges of assessing it holistically. In particular, the idea of reading, and so I'll expand on some of the thinking that I posted. The guidance some background first. We debated long and vociferously, I think is the best way to say it, around the use of presentations in the HLIT. And in the end, we came down on the following idea. Because of the inherent disparity for and of access to technology in IB schools, we didn't want to play to the bare minimum, saying, okay, you can't use a slide deck or something along those lines, because there are plenty of schools where students have access to those technologies. At the same point in time, we didn't want to reward students, say, in wealthy environments or who had access to technology for their presentations when schools in less developed areas or less wealthy areas of, or less wealthy schools, may not have access to that. And so we have to be agnostic about the presentation materials in of itself. So you and this is part of the reason why we initially were assessing the HLIT as an externally assessed component. And we realized very quickly that this wasn't feasible, and it takes a tremendous amount of time. So one of the trade-offs of using HLITs more and more in your classroom space is that it's going to take some time for you to assess it. But I think assess the student work. But I think it's good work that gets done. So in any event, we shifted to the internally assessed piece, and then we wanted to be agnostic about the use of it. So it does put some burden on you as the instructors to look past the presentation material and really listen to what the students are saying. Now, a couple of caveats in this regard. Students shouldn't be reading from text. I check all of my students before they go and present, so looking for notes. Index cards are preferable, although there's always a last-minute student who's got to print them out as opposed to having note cards. I will warn students and say, look, if you have something that isn't anything but bullet points and main ideas, and you happen to read, it's one thing to look down real quick. And just for full disclosure, I'm not using notes for any of the things that I talk about here. But if I were reading from this pretty consistently, it would mean that I don't have a full understanding of the topic at hand, the case, and that I also have a hard time applying that or synthesizing information as a result. The same holds true for slide decks. As we know, generally, text-heavy, dense PowerPoints really are the hallmark of pretty poor thinking. My advice to students is always, if you're going to use a PowerPoint or Keynote or a Google Slides or whatever medium that you use, that you focus on big ideas, on questions as opposed to answers, and that you use images and data more than anything else. The more text is on the slide, the less sophisticated presentation can be, particularly if a student's looking back and reading the text. Now, I know in a couple of samples you see a student do that. I would tend to think that as that attribute alone would mean the student doesn't necessarily have a command of the material, although in the one British girl's case, who was she was at a school, a colleague of mine from the first cohort, she has a strong command of the material. But she did make the nod, the sort of habitual nod back to the slide on a regular basis. I think reading off the slide, the slide consistently, and reading off the notes consistently are hallmarks of where you really can't get beyond, I think, 6 marks, satisfactory. Perhaps 7 to 8, I think, but it depends on context. Again, the attribute itself of reading isn't necessarily one where we penalize or reward, but they're often associated with students who don't have a solid command of the material and thus can't analyze and synthesize the material that they're presenting. I've seen excellent presentations where students are using a slide deck and notes, and I've seen excellent presentations with students using nothing. I had a student a few years ago who memorized the opening set of talking points. It wasn't scripted per se, but it was clear that she had, for about the first 2 minutes, had a solid introduction and outline of her thesis, and then transitioned and made it a bit more conversational. I just remember that in watching the single take that we did, because obviously all of these are single takes. I'm not sure I would necessarily always advise that students memorize information, because it takes away from the presentation. But you really are, as instructors, you're listening to what the student says and the way the student says and It's the audio and verbal material that the student is presenting rather than the imagery that goes along with it. I've seen terrible presentations, frankly, of students who've had slide decks, and it's clear that they have essentially rephrased others' arguments and provide no analysis whatsoever. And this gets to another point I think that touches on both the PEA and the HSIP, is that this is when it comes to bibliography. I think bibliographies are a bit more overt when it comes to the PEA, but it's important that before your students present, they fill out the assessment form, the presentation form, and they actually fill those boxes with their bibliography or attach them as well. We're now scanning all this material and uploading it, so I think it's easier just to handwrite it and scan it or type it out and then send it. We're going to upload it as part of assessment, but having that done beforehand. Last year I did not. Once we knew we were scanning these documents as opposed to sending them in, I wouldn't let a student present until they had that form completed. And so that's part of the assessment piece, is that the student comes, student's scheduled to go Monday, in first period, and that material is really ready Friday before they leave school, and saying, okay, here's my HSIP form. I filled everything out. That includes my bibliography, and then they can obviously use the weekend or whatever to prepare. But having that done beforehand is good practice, because then the students take it seriously. It's the same way when it comes to PEA paperwork. I would have the students fill that out before they submit their final version to make sure that everything is squared away. It's good. I think it's good. If I'm providing you with some advice, that's some good advice to do to the largest extent possible without signing everything, obviously, because you sign once the presentation or the PEA is submitted. But I do like the idea of having that paperwork filled out beforehand, with the bibliography, with the student work, with research question topics, things along those lines, the IB candidate number, et cetera, et cetera. Although in year one you may not have that, that's okay. And then having the student come in, present their material to you. You record that, obviously, and then once they're done, they're signing off, saying, "Look, this is my presentation." Even if it doesn't end up getting submitted, I think that the act of preparing diligently for the assessment piece and treating it as something that's authentic and consequential is a good way to approach it. But back to the holistic, holistic mark band. I think that understanding is like all assessment, it's subjective, but satisfactory understanding is beyond sort of beyond, it will clearly be on Wikipedia. I mean, I was going to say encyclopedic, but beyond sort of the generally common knowledge of understanding of the issue, and that the student needs to be able to be focused and clear and analytical in their approach to the case, and offer different perspectives and make the connection between their case study and the wider context of politics. So, for example, a few years ago, I had a student who was looking at girls' education in Pakistan, something relatively straightforward, but made strong connections to development in general, and the challenge that the idea that education can be both a lack of education can be an obstacle to development, as well as education can be one of those processes that allows individuals and groups in society to transcend pieces of poverty. So or challenges of poverty. So she can make both arguments there, as well as she included a gender component to it as well. So the wider context of world politics. She tied it into, we talk about girls' education in general, outside of Pakistan, or really the idea of gender equity in civil society. So she was able to make those cases and make arguments for that and competing claims as a result of her one case study of girls' education in Pakistan. That's an example of connecting a case study with some focused analysis from different standpoints, whether it's sort of classical IR, realist, liberal, and then critical theory, constructivist, Marxist, or taking the approach through identity, so ethnicity, nationality, religion, or gender. Using those frameworks to their fullest extent, I think that's what makes an excellent presentation. So it does, on the one hand, this rubric does leave you with I hate to say a fuzzy set because it sounds like it's undermining the rubric itself, but you do have some latitude to identify where your students fall into the levels. I'd make the same case that any quantitative assessment is as fuzzy, if not fuzzier, than the rubric we've got here. So all assessment is subjective in that sense. It's a standardized rubric, so all of us are working with this particular one. So, and I think it's a good one in the end. So I think I'm trying to go back and look just to double check. I think I got into everybody's topics that I remember from the PEA and the discussion forum. Again, oops, looks like Bill chimed in after I got there. See if I can address this question real quick. I'll wait 2 seconds. But in general, I think that you all are getting this. You really have a strong command. If you're engaging in the material or in the discussion, you're really engaging in there. Oh, Bill, you're in Destin. Oh, that's nice. You're over on the West Coast. Okay, just to address, let's think, samples there, that's fine, we've got that. So, so Bill, you actually asked the question, and with Mark's concern as well, is how to get students to choose topics that would fit the criteria of the course at a global scale. I think that's where, the interesting piece that goes with that, and I'm glad I got to this before you head off to the Tiki Bar, or hopefully you're going to see this when you get back to the Tiki Bar, or maybe tomorrow, perhaps. That's where the syllabus, again, I think is very, very instructive. That sort of spiral diagram that you see, and I'm getting to the page now, so you have a better sense of what I'm talking about, rather than me just make stuff up. Where did I go? I was just a screen must have just gone past it. Let's think. Sorry. Political key concepts, levels of analysis. That's fine. Engagement activity, research, extension. Okay, so we're on page 40. Sorry. Page 37 of the guide. Getting to the global scale, I think, is really one way to do it, and one strong way to do it, I think, is to think about, use that levels of analysis framework and have students think about what sort of things operate there in the first place. So this global idea is one of concepts, trends, big ideas, events. Terrorism, for example, is a global concept, and actors that use fear and violence for political aims, irrespective of what those political aims are. That could be, that's one of those examples that would fall into those domains. But it's very conceptual in nature. So if you're looking at since I mentioned, I'm just going to do this off the cuff, since I mentioned terrorism, I'm now stuck with terrorism. So if you're looking at the topic 6 of security, Boko Haram's a good example. There's plenty of data and competing literature on it that can analyze the extent to which Boko Haram, how they operate both from a local to a national, to a regional, to an international scale, and that does everything from international in terms of financing, down to identity politics, in the north of Nigeria. But connecting it to the so a case in Boko Haram would connect to the global scale insofar as obviously it's an example of terrorism. But what does Boko Haram do that makes it fall under the banner of terrorism? Are there groups that have similar behaviors, and so therefore Boko Haram is like those groups, or are they distinct? A couple of you brought up the example of Hezbollah in this assessment, and one of the things that makes Hezbollah distinct is that the organization is clearly a terrorist organization. They clearly use terror, but they also build schools and hospitals. And that's something that's very, very different. I think that's what distinguishes Hezbollah from other terrorist groups, or if you want to even split it further and say there are divisions and wings within the Hezbollah organization. Whereas in Boko Haram, that's not necessarily the case. They haven't established those civil society type of organs and functions in the same way that that Hezbollah does. And so connecting the global scale allows you to speculate and compare and contrast and discuss how Boko Haram or Group X, the extent to which they fit this definition of terrorism. So you may want to begin with conceptual definitions of, if I'm doing a presentation of Boko Haram, terrorism defined as A, B, and C. Here's how this person defines it. Here's how this person defines it. Dive deep into what Boko Haram is, and then come back and say, okay, at the end of the day, here's how we understand. Here's how my understanding of terrorism is informed by what Boko Haram is and what it does. At the same point in time, Boko Haram is a terrorist organization because they do these things. However, they may operate outside, whatever that may be. Off the cuff, that's sort of how I would approach it. But I think that's how, I think planning, just like with the PEA, planning is key. And working with the students to say, all right, what concepts are you, asking the questions. What concepts do you plan to use in your case? What conceptual definitions, do you have for each of these concepts? How does your case fit in? How is your case understood through levels of analysis? What theoretical frameworks are you going to use? What group perspectives, individual perspectives are pop up in these cases? And that allows you then to ensure that the students are getting at the case from as many ways as possible, but also back to that global level, and that say at the end of the day, okay, so what? Why does this matter? Why does studying Boko Haram matter? And so if you want to talk about it in terms of terrorism, if you want to talk about it in terms of, I'm not sure you could say anti-modernism, right? The idea that Boko Haram at its very, very core rejects aspects of development. So you can make a connection there to development as well, or to big ideas when it comes to education, certainly through gender equity and things like that. But that's the sort of discussion that you want to have with students. And if you can't answer those questions, or if better yet, if the student can't answer those questions, if they can't make a case in conversation with you, saying, okay, here's what I want to study, but if they can't get to the point where they can make the connection to the global level of analysis, then it may be time to either reconceptualize what you're looking at, or find something else. It's an indicator of, oh, if I'm so narrow in my particular study that I can't make a connection to global politics and international politics, I can't make connections to wider concepts, then maybe I need to rethink what I'm studying in the first place. And that's good. That's good teaching and learning anyway. So that may be one way to address your question, Bill, as I'm doing this right off the cuff. Yeah, you submitted this not that long ago. So okay, I've now run way too much time. You've probably had enough. So I'm going to start looking at your work for Module 4, starting tomorrow. Just as a reminder, this is planning. This is all the good stuff we want to get to in terms of resources and how to make this work. There's the optional challenge, which I would love to actually see you all do. This is a connection to Visible Thinking Routines, which is out of Project Zero at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Just ways to think about global politics in a different perspective, and then apply these sort of toolkits to to your classroom space. But start on Module 4 tomorrow. I'll check in a little later in the week. Message me tomorrow if you want to Skype, anywhere probably between 4 and 8 p.m. tomorrow East Coast time. And have a great rest of the day and rest of the week if I don't speak with you. Cheers.